It started as just another afternoon for James Robinson, a dedicated FBI agent on his day off. But within minutes, everything changed. Pinned to the ground, handcuffed, an officer's knee pressed into his back, James was treated like a criminal, accused with no evidence, judged without reason. The officers, Sergeant Mark Reynolds and Officer Kevin Harris, made a decision that day. A choice born of arrogance and ignorance. And in just 10 minutes, that choice would unravel everything they thought they knew about power, justice, and accountability. For James, this wasn't just an arrest. It was a fight against prejudice. But before we begin this story, tell us where you're watching from in the comments down below. And do you believe prejudice should be fought with prejudice or with grace and calm? Hit the subscribe button now to stand against prejudice and injustice. James began his day like so many others. A devoted father and husband, he was preparing for something simple, yet deeply personal. A small celebration for his daughter's birthday. He'd planned it all, a gift she'd been dreaming of, balloons, and her favorite cake. The morning was quiet, the kind of stillness that offers a brief escape from the demands of his work. As an FBI agent, James was no stranger to pressure. But today, he allowed himself to step back, even for a moment, to simply be a father. He parked his car on a busy street, blending into the flow of life around him. The casual wave to a familiar neighbor, the quick check-in call to his wife. "I'm grabbing the last few things now. I'll be home soon," he said with a smile. A man so deeply rooted in his family and his purpose. He wasn't wearing a badge today, just a plain shirt and jeans, looking like any other man with an errand to run. But elsewhere, the tone of the day was strikingly different. Sergeant Mark Reynolds and Officer Kevin Harris sat in their patrol car, talking in the way they often did, offhand, dismissive, and careless. Their conversation, as usual, circled back to the people they'd stopped in the past. "You know their type," Mark muttered, his tone sharp with irritation. "Always got some excuse. I didn't do anything." "Yeah, right?" Kevin laughed, but it wasn't genuine. It was the laugh of someone going along with the mood. They sat parked, watching, waiting, their attention half on the street and half on their own assumptions about the world around them. It was in that moment that they spotted James. Dressed casually walking to his car carrying a shopping bag, he was just another man on the street. But for Sergeant Mark, something about James didn't sit right. "You see him?" Mark asked, narrowing his eyes. Kevin glanced over, already knowing what was coming. "Yeah," he replied, his tone unsure. "What about him?" Mark shrugged, leaning forward in his seat. "Looks out of place, like a criminal hiding something, don't you think?" Kevin didn't respond, but the silence was enough for Mark. "Let's check it out," he said. As James reached his car, loading the bag into the back seat, he heard the sound of a patrol car pulling up behind him. The officers stepped out, their demeanor already charged with authority. "Sir, can we have a word?" Mark called out, his voice sharp. James turned, calm and unbothered, his hands resting at his sides. "Of course," he replied evenly. The questions came quickly, almost rehearsed. "What are you doing here? Is this your vehicle? Where are you coming from?" James answered calmly, each word measured, each answer clear. "I'm just running errands," he explained. "That's my car. Is there a problem?" But his composure didn't sit well with Mark. There was no defensiveness, no panic, none of the reactions he seemed to expect. "Do you have ID on you?" Mark asked, his tone now laced with impatience. James paused for a moment, his calm expression never wavering. "Yes, I do," he said. "May I ask what this is about?" Kevin shifted uncomfortably, glancing between James and Mark. He could feel the tension rising, the unspoken weight of a decision they hadn't yet made. But Mark was undeterred. "Just show me your ID," he barked, his voice growing louder. James moved slowly, reaching for his wallet, his movements deliberate, non-threatening. But as his hand approached his pocket, Mark's voice boomed. "Hands where I can see them." The command echoed, freezing the moment in time. James replied immediately, his voice steady. "I'm just reaching for my wallet," he explained again, his tone calm but firm. For a moment there was silence. Kevin looked at Mark, unsure if they should take it further. But Mark had already made up his mind. The tension between them hung thick in the air, though it came from only one side. Mark's eyes narrowed, his hand twitching near his holster. "I said, hands where I can see them," he shouted, his voice echoing off the nearby buildings. People in the parking lot paused, their movements slowing as they turned to watch. James raised his hands, his calm demeanor now carrying an edge of defiance. "I'm following your instructions," he said firmly, meeting Mark's glare without wavering. "This is harassment, and you have no justifiable cause to treat me like this." Mark took a step closer, his frustration mounting. "You think you get to decide that?" he snapped, gesturing toward James. "You don't look like a law-abiding citizen." James squared his shoulders, refusing to back down. "And what does that mean exactly?" he asked, his voice even but cutting. Mark hesitated, the words caught in his throat. It wasn't a question he could answer, and James knew it. The junior officer, Kevin Harris, stood to the side, his gaze flickering between the two men. He shifted uncomfortably, his instincts telling him this wasn't right. But Kevin stayed silent, his hands clenched at his sides as Mark pushed forward. "Turn around and put your hands on the car," Mark ordered, his voice rising. James didn't move. He stood his ground, his expression resolute. "I haven't done anything wrong," he said plainly. Mark's patience snapped. In one swift motion, he grabbed James by the arm, yanking him forward. "I said, turn around," he barked. Kevin stepped closer, his hesitation clear, but he didn't intervene. James pulled back slightly, his resistance not violent but deliberate. "You're out of line," he said, his voice low but firm. "You're making a mistake I'll make sure you regret." Mark's frustration boiled over, and in the next moment, he forced James toward the ground. The sound of the scuffle drew gasps from the growing crowd. Kevin hesitated again, his hand hovering in midair as Mark shoved James down, pressing his knee into his back. James winced but stayed calm, even as his face twisted in pain. His voice came out steady but strained. "This isn't going to end the way you think it will," he said. "Do you think James was right to stay calm, or rather he should have resisted and fought back? Tell us your experience about encounters like this you've witnessed in the comments down below, and don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button now." Mark didn't hear him, or chose not to. His focus was on cuffing James, his actions rushed and forceful. The junior officer crouched nearby, his expression conflicted. "Is this really necessary?" Kevin asked hesitantly. Mark shot him a glare. "You want to take over, Harris?" he snapped. Kevin shook his head, stepping back once more. By now, the scene had drawn a small crowd. Faces filled with shock and confusion lined the edges of the parking lot, watching in silence as James Robinson, an agent who had spent his life enforcing the law, was pinned to the ground like a criminal. Even then, James didn't lose his composure. His voice came out firm and controlled. "You have no idea who you're messing with," he said, his eyes meeting Mark's with quiet defiance. But Mark didn't listen, too blinded by his own authority to see the truth standing before him. The walk to the station was silent, apart from the sound of heavy boots and jangling cuffs. James Robinson, now restrained, kept his head high, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the arrogance of the officers escorting him. Mark Reynolds strode with confidence, his smirk lingering as if he'd just won a personal victory. Kevin Harris trailed behind, his face pale and uncertain, as the weight of the situation began to settle in his mind. Inside the station, the routine continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Mark led James to a holding area, his tone dripping with condescension. "Take a seat, someone will deal with you soon," he said, gesturing dismissively. James complied without a word, sitting down with the quiet composure of someone who knew time was on his side. Mark leaned against a desk, arms crossed, his smirk widening. "You think making a phone call is going to help you?" he sneered as James calmly requested his right to contact someone. Kevin stood off to the side, glancing nervously at his watch, unable to meet James's gaze. James didn't engage with Mark's taunts. Instead, he simply asked for a phone. His voice was steady, without a hint of desperation. "One call," he said. Mark rolled his eyes but relented, tossing a phone onto the desk. "Knock yourself out," he said, clearly unimpressed. James dialed quickly, his fingers steady as he keyed in a number he knew by heart. He spoke only a few words into the receiver, his tone calm and professional. "This is James Robinson, badge number 082745. I need you to verify my location immediately." He ended the call without waiting for a response, setting the phone down gently. Mark raised an eyebrow, letting out a derisive chuckle. "That's it? That's your big move?" he said, shaking his head. Kevin shifted uncomfortably, his unease growing with every passing second. Minutes ticked by. Mark's confidence remained intact, but Kevin's nerves were fraying. He glanced at the clock, then at the door, his mind racing with questions he didn't dare ask. And then the phone rang. It wasn't just any call. It came from the highest office James could summon. The deputy director of the FBI himself was on the line, his voice sharp and commanding as he demanded to speak with the station's senior officer. The message was clear and urgent. "Why is one of my senior agents in custody? Explain this immediately." Chaos erupted in the station as the message was relayed. A senior officer, Captain Howard, rushed into the room, his face pale and his expression strained. In his hands was a file, James Robinson's file, complete with his credentials and record. Howard scanned the room, his eyes landing on Mark. He pulled him aside, his voice a furious whisper. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he hissed. Mark's smirk disappeared in an instant, replaced by a look of dawning horror. Kevin stood frozen, his face ashen as he pieced together the gravity of their mistake. Howard approached James, his demeanor a mixture of apology and urgency. Without a word, he signaled for the cuffs to be removed. Mark fumbled, his hands shaking as he unlocked them. James stood, rubbing his wrists as he turned to face the two officers. His gaze was steady, his voice calm but unyielding. "You're not just reckless," he said, fixing his eyes on Mark. "You're dangerous, and you have no business wearing that uniform." Mark stammered, his words failing him. Kevin looked as though he might be sick, the weight of his silence in the parking lot now crushing him. The room was silent, apart from the hum of a fax machine in the corner, its monotony an eerie contrast to the tension hanging in the air. As James walked toward the door, Howard called after him. "Agent Robinson, I'm so sorry," he began, but James cut him off with a simple wave of his hand. He didn't look back, his stride confident as he left the station behind. The fallout, he knew, was only just beginning. The fallout began immediately. The deputy director's call had already set things in motion, but the full weight of the consequences hit like a hammer. Mark Reynolds, the lead officer, was summoned to the precinct's briefing room. He stood stiffly as the captain delivered the news in a tone colder than the metal badge being stripped from Mark's chest. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of duty. The FBI has demanded your termination and initiated prosecution for abuse of authority." The words hit harder than Mark expected. His arrogance, so firm just hours ago, had crumbled under the weight of his actions. The room was silent, except for the faint rustle of papers as the captain handed over the official order. Was the consequence of Mark's action justified or too excessive? Let us know down below and hit the subscribe button now if you want an end to prejudice and injustice in the world today. Understanding the far-reaching consequences of prejudice for everyone involved is essential to truly addressing and eradicating this issue. Mark looked around at his peers, some glaring, others unable to meet his eyes. The humiliation was absolute, and the reality of what he'd lost began to sink in. He opened his locker for the last time, pulling out a neatly folded commendation certificate from years ago. His name was scrawled across it in bold letters, a reminder of who he used to be, now tainted by a moment of unchecked prejudice. Meanwhile, Kevin Harris sat in the break room, his head in his hands. The guilt of his silence weighed heavier with each passing second. He replayed the moment in the parking lot over and over in his mind. The look in James Robinson's eyes, the crowd's stunned silence, the simple but powerful words James had said, "You're dangerous, and you have no business wearing that uniform." Kevin thought about quitting. He couldn't imagine putting on the badge again, not after standing by and doing nothing. But he couldn't imagine what would come next either. Outside the station, James Robinson sat in his car, the faint hum of the engine filling the quiet night. He rested his hands on the steering wheel, his composure unwavering despite the storm he had just weathered. He stared ahead for a moment, then pulled out his phone. "Hey," he said when his wife answered. His voice was calm, steady. "I'm okay. Just running late. Tell our girl I'll be there soon." He hung up and took a deep breath, the kind that steadied the soul. James wasn't just an FBI agent. He was a husband, a father, a man who refused to let the weight of injustice break him. Back inside the station, the ripple effects continued. The FBI's involvement meant more than just Mark's termination. A formal investigation had begun, and charges were being drawn up. Abuse of power, unlawful detainment, assault. Mark's career wasn't just over, it was the beginning of his reckoning. Kevin, however, wasn't the target of the investigation. His silence had cost him his peace, but his actions, or lack thereof, weren't criminal. Still, the realization haunted him. He had a choice that day, and he chose wrong. The thought burned in his mind as he wrote out his resignation letter, each word feeling heavier than the last. And for James, the events of the day were a reminder of the work still left to do. As he drove home, he reflected on what had happened. Not just the arrest, but the way it exposed something far deeper. "Some mistakes change your life forever," the narrator's voice concludes. For these officers, their mistake wasn't just in who they arrested, it was in how they saw the world. James walked into his home that evening, greeted by the warm embrace of his family. The fight wasn't over, but in that moment, surrounded by love and resilience, he knew he'd won the battle that mattered most. If this story resonated with you and you believe in building a future free from prejudice, subscribe now. Join us as we expose and address the far-reaching impacts of prejudice, one powerful story at a time.